Bien, entonces ahí estaríamos, ¿no? ¿Sí? Bueno,
And these languages, the three languages, are not strictly speaking, intellectual currents into which different authors can be sorted. I believe this mode of practicing intellectual history is now obsolete. Instead, these three languages constitute sets of arguments as well as rhetorical resources with a fairly long legacy. So let me begin first by recalling very quickly that the Enlightenment does not possess a monopoly on the idea of universal of course. Indeed, it was constructed in opposition to two traditional figures and powerful figures of universalism, uh, Christianity on the one hand, and universal monarchy on the other hand. The Enlightenment countered this, this with a new language based on religious pluralism and the moral autonomy of individuals. Truth was no longer revealed by sacred speech, nor imposed by imperial power, but should be discovered and recognized by each person. The content of truth remained universal, but this universality now lied at the level of the human being as a rational and sentient being. And such a conception, that's very important to see that such a conception opens a space for debate, controversy, and intellectual confrontation far more than it offers a unified doctrine for concerning universalist morality or politics. That is why I propose to distinguish different languages of the universal and even perhaps what I would call effects of universality, as Roland Barthes spoke of effects of reality, that is, theoretical and rhetorical devices that enable one to strive towards universality. So I call cosmopolitan universalism the first of these three languages. It is rooted in a reflection on religious toleration, which was at the heart of European thought at the dawn of the Enlightenment, during what Paul Hazard termed the crisis of European consciousness, the end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century in Europe. The two great texts of this period are John Locke's famous letter concerning toleration of 1689 and a somewhat lesser known text by Pierre Bayle, written while he was a refugee in Rotterdam in reaction to the revocation of the Edit Nantes Edict. And this text by Pierre Bayle, the philosophical commentary on the words of Jesus Christ, compelled them to come in, is a really extraordinary manifesto for the rights of conscience and against any temptation to convert by force. Bayle, in this text, did not rest with the classical doctrine of tolerance, which endures the existence of heretics as a necessary evil. He went much further. No one can claim, in the name of reason, to possess religious truths. Only sincere and authentic faith without external constraint guarantees truth, but only an inner truth, which need not to be imposed upon others. And the result is twofold. First, Bayle delivers a vibrant plea for religious pluralism, for what he calls, in French, the word is bigarrure. And he used it in opposition to homogeneity. Bigarrure is the presence of different colors in the same place. Religious diversity was no longer a threat, as in medieval Christian universalism, but a wealth, since toleration based on reason has become the new universal. Second, this diversity emancipates itself from the boundaries of Christendom, opening its scope to Jews, Muslims, and atheists. And that's where Pierre Bayle was really a revolutionary thinker. Bayle even posits the hypothesis, the incredible for the time hypothesis of Muslim missionaries sent by the Turks to Europe, and he affirmed that they should be accepted. They should not be persecuted. And it was by means of reciprocity, since the Europeans do the same when sending Christian missionaries to Japan or the Americas. Bayle articulated questions that would span the entire 18th century. Once reason has taken the place of religion as the basis for common morality and regulating social behavior, what place should religion occupy in the social order? Should they be regarded as dangerous and useless, fundamentally tied to superstition and fanaticism? This was the answer of materialists and atheists like Baron d'Holbach. Should they be removed of dogmas, or should faith and revealed religion be given a place in the social order, and if so, how should it be regulated? But the essential question regarding universalism was the framing of moral issues, not at the scale of one country or at the scale of Christendom, but at the scale of humanity, from the standpoint of what Bayle and many authors have been called the citizen of the world, whether this citizen of the world is Christian or Muslim, European or Turkish. The cosmopolitan question concerns the ties that can or must be instituted beyond customary confessional, cultural, and political boundaries on the basis not of a single faith, but of a common humanity. And this is why I call it the cosmopolitan universalism, because cosmopolitanism has a double movement, as the philosopher Kwame Appiah has observed. First, one must recognize obligation to all other humans beyond kinship, friendship, or national ties. And in this respect, cosmopolitanism is truly a universalism. And second, it shows interest in the richness of cultural diversity, in the plurality of practices and beliefs that give meaning to human life. This universalism is neither an abstraction nor a desire for global cultural unification, but rather it is a way of confronting the truths of others, as I like this quote, the truth of confronting the truths of others. It's a quote by the sociologist Ulrich Beck. The success of cosmopolitan ideals in the 18th century was not an abstract notion. Sometimes people call this cosmopolitan universalism an abstract universalism, but I don't do that because it was rooted in concrete changes in mobility and sociability, as the historian Daniel Roche, French historian Daniel Roche has shown in his book, not translated, unfortunately, Humeur Vagabonde, a great book about mobility, social, demographic, and cultural mobility in the 18th century. The improvements of road and transportation facilitated travel, the vote for the European Grand Tour, the development of big cities like Paris and London or Vienna, fueled by the arrival of provincial and foreigners, the networks of learned academies, the expansion of the periodical press, bringing news from Europe and the world, and of course, Freemasonry and its network of lodges. The word cosmopolitan itself appeared for the first time in a French dictionary in 1721 with the meaning of a man to whom the world is a city or a homeland. I am a cosmopolitan, that is to say, a citizen of the universe. That was a new word for a new idea based on religious toleration, but enlarged to the question of global humanism. And this word gradually took on a double meaning: citizen of the world, but also a man without attachments, loving therefore neither place nor people. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for example, who was not fond of cosmopolitan people at all, he wrote, "Such a philosopher loves the Tartars in order to be excused for loving his neighbors." And this critique of cosmopolitanism in the name of patriotism, of course, will have a very long legacy. In the latter half of the 18th century, the figure of the cosmopolitan increasingly stands opposed, for better and for the worse, the newly esteemed figure of the patriot, or the Republican patriot. Other authors, however, affirm the value of the cosmopolitan ideal, especially in political and geopolitical contexts. Kant, Immanuel Kant, for example, in his 1795 treatise toward perpetual peace, affirms the existence of a cosmopolitan right, distinct from civil right and the law of nations. Cosmopolitan right, without which world peace is impossible, regards individuals as citizens of a universal state of humanity. Citizens of a universal state of humanity. A state that does not exist politically, but is grounded in the existence of a single common world within which it is necessary to foster mutual relations in order to advance the unity of humankind. The foremost principle of cosmopolitan rights is universal hospitality, according to Kant. That is the right, I quote, the right for a foreigner upon arrival in another's territory, not to be treated as an enemy. You might see there is some contemporary echoes of this cosmopolitan right of hospitality. And Kant was also very careful to distinguish this right of visitation from colonial enterprises, which he condemned. The play Nathan the Wise, played by the famous German writer Gotthard Ephraim Lessing, Nathan the Wise offers a magnificent plea for cosmopolitan and tolerant universalism. Toleration in Nathan the Wise is presented as the ability to transcend cultural and religious differences, but not to erase them, rather to allow their peaceful coexistence in a human community enriched by difference and oriented towards the emulation of virtue. I'm sure you know, but I recall that the play took place in Jerusalem during the Crusades. And it's the relationship between Saladin, the Muslim Saladin, and a Jewish guy, Nathan, and also a Christian Templar. And in the play, one moment, the most famous part is the debate between Saladin and Nathan. But at another moment, Saladin says to the Christian Templar these words: Christian or Muslim, it doesn't matter. In a white cloak or a kaftan, with a turban or whatever headdress you wish, I never required that all trees have the same bark. It is a Muslim sovereign talking this way. So here again, in the contemporary echoes of this, not only in the Muslim world, but also for those of you who are familiar of the French political debate about universalism. Oh, I preside when I explain this, and I put this sentence in a French setting, in a French context. People are always struck by this affirmation of the liberty of the way of the head chief. It's of course a very important universalism might be a respect for different ways, different customs, different way of behaving. I mean, a famous and powerful commentary of Lessing's play, Hannah Arendt, saw in Lessing the form Enlightenment may assume when it strives to preserve the possibility of a common world thanks to the resources of language and friendship, even in the dark time of war and terror. And friendship, according to Hannah Arendt, was the key word, because friendship is the to acknowledge the other with his differences, not as the same, but as different. So this is for cosmopolitan universalism, and of course, I'm conversely sketchy. Alongside this language of toleration and cosmopolitanism based on reciprocity in the present, Enlightenment thinkers developed another approach to the diversity of societies and cultures, that is, through history. Whereas reason is universal, the capacity of individuals to make use of it depends on prevailing social, political, and cultural conditions. And this is what I call this hypothesis is what I call the Enlightenment's historical universalism. For many philosophers and historians in the 18th century, the history of humanity was a movement from savage or barbarian societies in which the human mind was still in its infancy to civilized ones where people are capable of understanding the world around them thanks to science and of understanding their own human nature thanks to philosophy. The neologism of civilization, the basic conceptual frame of Enlightenment historical thought, was developed precisely to describe this historical transformation of society. Certainly, universal histories in the 18th century were far from having the theoretical coherence they would acquire in the following century, for instance, with Hegel or Marx, and they were uncertain as to the apparently unfinished or interrupted evolution of certain Eastern civilizations, notably in India or China, and they were also wary of progress going too far. That's a very important theme of Enlightenment thinking. It was the fear maybe European civilization was already going too far. The fear of decadence. However, their goal was to take into account the entire history of humanity in order to tell the story of a progressive move towards human autonomy driven by the progress of knowledge. The Scottish historians especially developed the idea of a succession of historical stages, as in Adam Ferguson's History of Civil Society. William Robertson, History of the Reign of Charles V, highlighted the turning point Europe experienced in the 16th century with the failure of universal monarchy. And David Hume argued that a system of rival but interdependent states in Europe enabled progress in art and science. Of course, from Edinburgh to Paris, from Naples to Göttingen, this history of civilization took different forms. However, besides these differences, the dominant historical narrative constitutes one of the essential structures of Enlightenment thought, and it was taken up and developed by Gibbon in Britain at the end of the century, and then in the early 19th century by Guizot. In this narrative, each people were supposed to go through the same historical process leading from savagery to the age of reason. In this view, the history of Europe since the 16th century represented something of a paragon, a cumulative progress of arts and sciences, of trade and morals had taken place there and only there. In fact, Europe served as a model by which to judge the progress of civilization as a whole. The measure of the universal was no longer the abstract individual, the citizen of the world, but it was the European man. For example, in Voltaire's historical work, which provided in some ways the matrix for this history of civilization, there was a strong tension between the universalist principle that aimed to broaden history on a global scale and to stress the achievement, for example, of Eastern civilization, and on the other hand, a Eurocentric principle according to which, I quote Voltaire, everything is our business, everything is done for us. And by us, Voltaire meant the Europeans. How then was the expansion of civilization possible on a global scale? Most philosophers rejected colonization as the violent imposition of European manners and norms. They favored either a model of local development through authoritarian political reforms, like those of Peter the Great in Russia, or mostly a model of diffusion via commerce, both economic and intellectual commerce. Commerce would enable a social transformation that made liberty desirable and fostered individual autonomy. Europe provided the model intended to inspire admiration and emulation. When Condorcet, at the end of the century, speculated about what he called the propagation of enlightenment across the globe, he assured his reader that the universal path towards civilization would take the form of everyone imitating, I quote, the most enlightened people. Liberty, he thought, would subjugate all people. It is easy to notice the ambiguity of the verb subjugate. It designated an intellectual and moral fascination, the irresistible power of the Western modern of liberty, but it could also, of course, evoke a form of domination, subjugation. The civilization gap did not only divide Europeans from the rest of the world. Inside Europe itself, it set up several fault lines. A mental gap opposed a Western uncivilized Europe to an Eastern Europe that had barely emerged from serfdom, autocracy, and superstition, as Larry Wolff has shown in a wonderful book about Eastern Europe. Even within Western Europe, French writers, for example, saw themselves as forerunner of civilization and felt free to disparage Spain and Portugal. That's the birth of a lot of critical works in the 18th century French Enlightenment Spain. And rivalry with England, above all in colonial context, led French writers to put British barbarism in opposition to French civilization. More generally, the French developed a kind of cultural imperialism based on the European prestige of their core practices, social customs, theater, and especially the French language. Inside France itself, there was a further divide between elites and ordinary people. Enlightenment philosophers and writers thought that they had to civilize and to enlighten was quite the same thing, to enlighten and to civilize ordinary people in order to raise them to the civilization ideal. And they knew that it would take a long time. So the history of civilization thus unfolded on several scales: the globe, the European continent, the nation itself. Universalism implied a progressive widening of knowledge, which would allow individuals to reason and feel for themselves, but was not given. It was the result of a historical, social, and cultural process. And I want to stress, it's important that this concept of civilization was quickly adopted by elites outside Europe. For example, in the Rio de la Plata, here in Argentina, in several articles published in the Gazeta of Buenos Aires, Mariano Moreno emphasized the need to educate the people in order to transform, to make a political people out of the multitude. And as you well know, better than me, I'm sure, it was deeply influenced by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Republican writings, but also maybe by Renard, historical writings. And in the next generation, Sarmiento made frequent use of the concept of civilization, drawing openly on the work of François Guizot. And of course, I am referring to the wonderful book by Professor Borucoa on civilization. I know very little about the context, but it's very interesting to see how this notion of historical universalism and this notion of civilization has been, it's not just a European ideal, it has been used and transformed and appropriated. It's very important in different contexts by enlightened elites who saw themselves at the forefront of the enlightenment. Now faced with this historical universalism, several authors have developed yet another approach to universality as a critical tool against the prejudices, abuses, and contradiction of civilized Europe. This is the third language of universalism that I want to discuss with you today. This questioning of European and indeed French exemplarity by putting forward a point of view grounded in cultural and anthropological diversity has, of course, a longer history. It can be found, for example, in Montaigne's famous text on the cannibals, which he commented upon his encounter with indigenous people from Brazil and concluded with relativist skepticism. Everyone called barbarism what is not his own custom. And in the 17th century, libertine authors developed a skeptical geography in opposition to the Christian universalism of the missionary. But in the 18th century, this critical gesture took another turn. First, with the dialogue of the Baron de la Hontan with the savage, a fictional dialogue in which a Huron named Adario challenges the author's argument step by step and demonstrates the contradictions and hypocrisies of European civilization. For example, at one point, Adario exclaimed, "What kind of men are the Europeans? Oh, what kind of creatures?" But maybe the author who was the more influent and the more vocal on this topic was Diderot, Denis Diderot, who provided the most powerful version of this critical universalism, and especially in the text in some parts of the Renal book on the history of the two Indies, but also and mostly in his supplément Voyage de Bougainville, supplement to Bougainville's voyage, which was intended as a critique of European imperialism, supposedly derived from the rational and natural common sense of the Tahitian. This text, which took off from Diderot's reading of Bougainville's Voyage autour du monde, was a high point of Enlightenment dialogism. Its daring cannot be underestimated. While Bougainville's expedition could appear at this moment as the incarnation of enlightened universalism, driven by genuine scientific curiosity, after all, it was not a colonial enterprise, but a scientific enterprise, yet Diderot challenged it by inventing two Tahitian figures who questioned the discourse of European authority. First, the old, what we call the old man, the vieillard Tahitien, who warned his Tahitian compatriots about the moral and political effects of the European intrusion in nuclear. So that's the old Tahitian man speaking to his fellow Tahitians. Someday they will return, bearing in one hand that piece of wood you see suspended from this one's belt, and in the other, the piece of steel that hangs at the sides of his companion. They will load you with chains, slit your throats, and enslave you to their follies and vices. Someday you will be slaves to them. You will be as corrupt, as vile, as wretched as they are. And then, addressing Bougainville, he exclaimed, "Leave us our own customs, which are wiser and more decent than yours. We have no wish to barter what you call our ignorance for your useless knowledge." And in French, the text says, "Vos inutiles lumières." Nous n'avons pas besoin de vos inutiles lumières. We possess already all that is good and necessary for our existence. You will merit your scorn because we have not been able to create superfluous wants for ourselves. Des besoins, méritons-nous notre mépris parce que nous n'avons pas su nous créer des besoins inutiles, mais des besoins superflus. So this criticism of European useless knowledge in the name of the natural simplicity and coherence of Polynesian society was a narrow fire directly at the heart of the model of civilization. And this self-criticism of the Enlightenment, with its Rousseauian overtone, highlighted the imperialist arrogance of Europeans, who were convinced that their model of happiness was the only possible one. Through the voice of this fictional Tahitian, Diderot contrasted the innocence of the natural life of the Polynesians, whose morality was entirely dictated by the code of nature, to the hypocritical values of the corrupt European civilization. The universalism of human nature, valid, as Diderot wrote, at all times and in all places. And that's quite a definition of universalism. And this universalism served here to criticize European morals, European manners, European traditions, not to enforce them, not to legitimize them, but to criticize them. And this position was also distinguished and defined by the role and the importance of specific situation of enunciation in which the author aimed at questioning the universalist claims of European culture in order to contrast them to another superior universalism. This critical universalism was often expressed in fictional form. European writers tried to give a voice to those who did not fit the traditional model of universality, non-European and also women. Thus, the sentimental novel, a popular form of women's writings, challenged the connection between reason, masculinity, and universality. From Françoise de Graffigny to Isabelle de Charrière, several women novelists used the epistolary genre to challenge dominant conceptions of the modern autonomous individual as masculine and rational, and to suggest ways of building a common world on the basis of objective forms of attachment. Françoise de Graffigny, that I just mentioned, is particularly important because her novel, Les Lettres d'une Péruvienne, was a bestseller in its time. It has been somewhat forgotten after that, but it was really a bestseller. It tells the story of an Inca princess kidnapped by the Spanish and then by the French, abandoned by her own lover, and who eventually finds peace and even happiness by refusing to marry with her French protector. And the book is filled with scathing condemnation of European crimes. And all along, Zilia, the main character, speaks of the French people she meets as savages. Well, I don't have time, of course, to fully explore these three figures of universalism, but I want to emphasize that each one carries contradictions that are difficult to solve. I'm not advocating for one of these universalism against the other, even if critical universalism today seems more, politically correct, but that's not my point. That's my point, not to say, well, there's bad universalism, but there's a good universalism. That's not my point. My point is that each have difficulties. Cosmopolitan universalism implies a definition of human nature, and this means deciding on the boundaries of humanity, a question so essential to all Enlightenment thought. For example, Kantian cosmopolitanism of Immanuel Kant was very often limited to Europe on a legal point, and it was not at all immune to racism, as it is based not only on moral universalism, but also on a much more problematic anthropology, fraught with prejudice. Conversely, by considering the equality of individuals solely by the perspective of their shared rationality, this universalism prevents us from effectively thinking about much of the historical and cultural depths of society. This tension which lies at the heart of Kant's work, philosophical work, and interpretations of it, makes cosmopolitanism more, I would say, of a utopian project than a genuine moral and political program. As for historical universalism, it readily introduces a condescending and ethnocentric paternalism, which seeks to establish a particular historical reality as a universal model. It can quickly shift towards justifying colonization and theories of assimilation. And it was particularly the case in France, where it served as the basis for both the civilizing mission in the colonial empire in the 19th century and Republican universalism with its desire to eradicate cultural differences within the national community. And finally, critical universalism can drift toward forms of moral relativism and glorification of violence, even for good reason. But there is also another limit to critical universalism. Diderot, for example, as I've shown, was very eloquent and vocal about the crimes of European colonization. But he was not really interested in the fate and point of view of real colonization. He mentioned in his text, in the supplement of Bougainville's voyage, he mentioned a Tahitian named Aoutouroup, who came to Paris with Bougainville, but he claimed that Aoutouroup was unable to understand what happened to him and what he saw in Europe. In this paternalistic judgment, one can see a genuine blind spot of the Enlightenment, even when they criticize Europe. The philosophers, European philosophers of the 18th century, always did so from their own perspective, as if they were the only ones who possess a universal view of the world. And this was the topic of my last book that you mentioned, the illusion of a common world, about Diderot. In highlighting these difficulties, I'm not seeking to invalidate these universal languages, because I believe that their legacy is essential today in order to avoid being trapped in particular identities and to consider, and it is essential to consider the possibility of a common world. But the essential point I want to emphasize is that Enlightenment universalism is by no means a clear and coherent doctrine, a monolithic philosophical heritage to be defended or rejected. This universalism was plural, it was contradictory, it was ambivalent. Its ambition, in fact, was maybe excessive, to lay down universal standards of truth, justice, beauty, whatever, when modern experience is one of infinite cultural diversity. The grandiose project of a humanist universalism based on the autonomy of individuals and the uniqueness of human nature came up against obstacles that opened up a broad field of debate involving anthropology and history. The legacy of the Enlightenment should not be confused with the dogmatic assertion of rational cosmopolitan universalism, nor with the Eurocentric philosophy of history, but even with skeptical questioning of the benefits of civilization. These different positions coexist and intermingle all the more effectively because none of them succeeded in resolving the difficulty they faced. Thus, they led to a genuine conflict of universalism, which provided the backdrop for most of the controversy that animated intellectual life in the 18th century, and I would add, since the 18th century, and maybe for questions. And finally, I hope that this detour into intellectual history will help to nuance the ways in which the Enlightenment is used in contemporary debates. If we move away from caricatures and preconceived ideas the plurality of universalist languages that run the Enlightenment may allow us to reflect on other ways of thinking about the universal today at the crossroads of two requirements, the maintenance of humanist and rationalist horizons, which is by no means a European monopoly, and a respect for the diversity of languages and culture. Universalism should not mean neither assimilation into a dominant culture, no commercial globalization, but rather a desire to produce common ethics and norms based on the dialogue, the recognition, and the overcoming of differences. Thank you very much.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Antoine, por la tan iluminadora y sugerente conferencia. Sí. Bueno, entonces vamos a un espacio de comentarios, preguntas, etcétera, que pueden venir tanto de aquí, de la sala, como de quienes nos están viendo vía online. Así que se abre el espacio. Sí.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, you are. And now yeah, you're perfectly right. You're perfectly right. I should have stressed this point, but the question of gender, the question of race is also can appear in the different elements. It's of course a central debate. For the historical universalism, it's of course a very important topic in these debates because, for example, I mentioned the Scottish historians, and as my colleague Silvia Sebastiani has shown, the question of the status of women was a central element in the conceptualization of the civilization progress. This idea that in civilized, one criteria for civilized societies was better status, more liberty for women. But of course, it was also so many authors reflected about the fact that the condition of women, the social condition and cultural condition of women was a criteria for the place of a society in the scale of civilization. But of course, there's also some consequences because it was also the basis for what has been called also the imperialism in the name of women. for example, in the 19th century, the colonization, French colonization in the Arabic world, and especially North Africa, has very often legitimized itself by the idea of improving the legal status of women. It was but you're right that the question of women was central in the historical discourse in civilization, and on the question of the cosmopolitan universalism is a bit different. I would say that mostly in this current of thought and this text, the question of women was not very often addressed because they were the citizen of the world is supposed to be a man. That's why it's the critical and it's based on reason, and that's why the many women used the sentimental novel to criticize this aspect of the cosmopolitan universalism. And in Lessing's place, women, in Kant's philosophy, not a lot of reflection about women. So that's probably a blind spot of cosmopolitan universalism, this question.
Muy bien. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? Chat. Jorge Myers. Por ahí traduzco la pregunta al castellano brevemente para cómo las tres figuras del universalismo se sitúan en relación a la perspectiva de Jonathan Israel del Radical Universalism, de la ilustración radical, para quienes nos están escuchando.
Okay, thank you very much. Briefly, well, I have to say I'm very critical of Jonathan Israel's radical enlightenment. I've written articles and long chapter in my Legacy of the Enlightenment to criticize work. So, well, I don't buy neither the centrality of Spinoza. I think Jonathan Israel overestimates dramatically the influence of Spinoza. Spinoza was very important, but it was not so much read, and it was not the only in the 18th century. And also, I don't buy the opposition between radical and moderate enlightenment. I think it just doesn't work. For example, Pierre Bayle, it's very difficult to see. I don't think to determine if he's radical or moderate thinkers. For Israel, Pierre Bayle is a Spinozist, a hidden Spinozist, and radical Spinozist, but I think it's not true. And that's why I criticize that I am not dividing Enlightenment thinkers in three different currents fighting one against another. As I'm not replacing the duality of Israel's approach by a trilogy of three currents fighting against one another, because I think it's not how it worked. That's why I speak of languages, and I think that in with some authors you can find the three of these languages. For example, Voltaire. Voltaire, it's very difficult because if you read historical works by Voltaire, L'Essai sur les mœurs, say, okay, it's the history of civilization. It's exactly the historical universalism in the story of civilization. But in other texts, you can find a lot of elements, devices, languages that partake to cosmopolitan universalism, of course, citizen of the world, but there was also protagonist of this language, and sometimes even, especially, for example, in some novels, element of the critical universalism. So that's my big difference with Jonathan Israel. I don't speak of currents of thought, I speak of different languages and different intellectual and narrative resources.
¿Alguien más? Adrián Gorelli.
That's you want to say.
Sí,
So
básicamente,
about.
básicamente cómo la ilustración hace frente a la era del nacionalismo, cómo
That's a very important point. I would not say that Enlightenment penetrated nationalism. I would say that he created nationalism, in fact, and that's paradoxical. But there was different languages of nationalism and patriotism, but one of them was deeply rooted in Enlightenment thought, and especially in Republican, the Republican current of Enlightenment thought, and nationalism in this perspective was a political project. It was not the affirmation of an irreducible ethnic difference. It was a political project, and it was patriots in this, nationalists in this Enlightenment perspective. They did not thought of their project as contrary to universalism. They thought it as a universalist project itself. And the example, the best example is the French Revolution. The French Revolution is in some way a nationalist political project, the Great Nation, la Grande Nation, and a universalist political project, since it aims at giving a model, a political model, and patriotic model that can be used in different contexts and has been used in different contexts. And especially if you think of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in 1789, it is a text which is both a universalist text, but it's also a very nationalist and patriotic text. It's about the nation. It's about the rights of nation. It's about the rights of the citizen. It's not about the citizen of the world. It's not about the rights of hospitality, as Kant would have said. It's about how to create a sovereign nation. So, and this contradiction between universalism and a nationalist political project is at the center of Enlightenment thought, and it is not the same that particular nationalism which will raise in the 19th century on different bases, and especially romanticism, historical ethnicity, and so on.
Santiago Rogeroni. Rápidamente traduzco dos preguntas, una de orden metodológico. ¿Cuál es el lugar de la noción del lenguaje dentro de tu reconstrucción? La noción que empleas. Y la segunda es una noción que no aparece, que no aparecía en tu exposición, la noción de capitalismo. ¿Qué interjuego puede haber, si es que hay alguno, entre esta noción con las tres perspectivas que has presentado aquí?
Okay, thank you very much. That two very important big questions. I'm not sure I'm able to answer. But first, well, why languages? I feel that is my use of languages is a bit under conceptualized. Why I've chosen this word, maybe with the influence of John Pocock, which I think is one of the greatest intellectual historian of the 20th century. But also because it's, as I said before, it's a way of distinguish myself from history of ideas in terms of currents of thought, also in terms of ideas. I'm not writing history of ideas or long durée history of ideas, which is currently a very important strand of intellectual history, especially in the United States today, with David Armitage, Darren McMahon, and so on. I don't want to make history of ideas. I don't want to make history of intellectual currents. And why not discourses? Because I wanted to stress the fact that these languages of universalism are very dependent of their the textual and narrative form that they do. And for example, that's why very often the difference between the cosmopolitan and the critical universalism is on the situation, the fictional situation of enunciation that took place in this text. And that's why I use the word languages, but well, I'm totally ready to confess that is not enough in terms of methodological conceptualization. So you're right. I have to think more about it and how to conceptualize in a methodological level this firm. And if you have any clues, I'm really eager. And the second question is very difficult. I've never, in the 18th century, in 18th century text, I don't think the notion of capital is very prominent. What is central is, well, first the question of wealth, of course, and Adam Smith is going here, but mostly the question of commerce. The central word, the central concept is not capital. That will come a bit later. It is the notion of commerce. It is at the center of political economy, and it is at the center of the notion of civilization. Why? Because in the 18th century, first you have this the influence before political economy. You have the influence of Montesquieu, and for Montesquieu, the du commerce, and this idea that after the ruin of universal monarchy, commerce will bring peace, will bring refinement, and will bring the moral progress of society. And commerce is polysemous because you have economical commerce, of course, but it was strongly connoted as social, also as social commerce, sociability, the improvement of manners. For example, David Hume wrote a lot about this. So the important, the central concept linked political economy and the historical universalism was the notion of commerce.
Bien, una otra pregunta, Elías. Vale.
Um, uh, well, that's that question. Um, my idea is not that these languages are absolutely specific to the 18th century. What I try to claim is that these languages were, I think, had emerged in the 18th century, that their so that way of, as you understood, that of pluralizing more than historicizing the Enlightenment. But, and I have not shown today, but my conviction is that these languages had a long legacy, had a long posterity, and you can find them in the 19th and even the 20th century. And I think that a lot of, for example, I worked on the colonial discourses, colonial justifications in France in the 19th century, and you can find a lot of elements of the historical Enlightenment language, and or if you take the French Revolution, or if you take some element of even you can say that some element of post-colonial or decolonial critiques of modernity, in fact, and even though they really acknowledge that, we use some elements, some resources of the critical language. So my argument is not that you can find in the 18th century some elements, some languages that are uniquely in the 18th century. My argument is that universalism is a very contradictory claim, and that's why we are always talking about the universalism, and usually we don't really know what we are talking about. Universalism, what is exactly universalism? It's never clear because it's very rarely defined. And modern universalism coming from the 18th century, I think we can, this plurality of languages can help us to understand what is going on. So my argument was not so much about historicizing in the sense of claiming the specificity of Enlightenment, these languages of universalism. It was much more claiming the plurality, the irreducible plurality of the origins of modern universalism. I hope it helps. But you're not, you don't seem to be convinced. But well, I'm sorry, maybe it's not very clear. Okay. So very quickly, okay, I understand better the question. So very quickly, thank you very much. I would say two things. First, I totally agree with you with the fact that the historian task is to identify differences, and that's why I emphasize the fact that, well, modern universalism, if you want to call it like this, was totally different from previous forms of universalist languages. And for example, I totally agree with you, what I call the universalist, the historical universalism based on the notion of civilization is a language that it was not possible before the birth of historical thinking in the sense of a history of a linear history of progress. But for Kozelek, it started in the middle of the 18th century. It's not after the Enlightenment. And I think that now scholars are totally convinced that Enlightenment thought was deeply informed by historical thinking. That's why, but that's, and you're right, and cosmopolitan universalism, for example, was based on the history of the notion of a common human nature. It was something, and it was based on the evolution of biological knowledge in the natural history, rather, knowledge in the 18th century. So you're perfectly right. These languages and their novelty in the 18th century were based on a specific transformation of the sciences or a more general context of thought. And finally, what is specific to 18th century, you will not find later. I would say maybe the fact of these three languages were really fighting in the sense of, you mentioned Hegel, but that wasn't that, or you can say that many languages are universalist, not language, but universalist discourses, for the case in the 19th century, philosophical universalism of reason, Hegel, universalism of colonial European civilization. They were sort of monolithic discourses. They were not so much informed by the temptations of managing a place for internal critique. That's very obvious. Take, for example, the historical discourse. That is why I mentioned the fact that the historical narrative of civilization in the 18th century, they exist, but they are not at all the same. They were much more cautious than the philosophy of history you can find in the German idealism of the 18th century. So there are these, the language exists, but it is much more tracked into the sense of this contradiction.
Muy bien, bueno, vamos a ir terminando. No sé si... Sí, Gastón.
That's a very good question. Thank you. The I'm not sure. Unfortunately, I'm not sure there is a real theory of translation in the sense of Bashir, Suleiman Bashir Diane. For example, in Madame de Graffigny, Madame de Graffigny was fascinated by the quipu. And a lot of remarks in the book on the fact that Zelia used quipus to communicate, and she thought that Madame de Graffigny wrote that sort of a language, the quipus. And our common friend Roger Chartier has recently worked on this question, but it was not really theorized. It was not really conceived as a very an important object because, and I think that because 18th century writers were too strongly convinced of the universalism of the French language. That's the moment where Rivarol, I didn't mention in the talk, but I've and to Rivarol wrote de l'universalité de la langue française, universality of the human language. So, and even Diderot, for example, in the supplement, he introduced, he knew that, of course, there is a theoretical problem how a Tahitian can can talk to Bougainville, since they have no common language. So he had to introduce a fiction that they speak in Spanish, because in the 16th century, the Spanish had come in the Pacific, and so they can speak in Spanish. But of course, it was mostly a joke for the readers. It was not really a conceptualization of translation as a way of sharing differences, of overcoming and acknowledging the cultural differences. I think that there you have to wait the 19th century to have a real, with the real conceptualization of translation as a way of dealing with cultural differences on one side and universalist ideals in the other one. Thank you.
Bueno, muy bien.
Thank you very much.
Agradecemos una vez más a Antoine y a todos los quienes nos han seguido a través de la conexión virtual y a los aquí presentes. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.